Clara, what the hell is happening? Liam stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the icy Chicago street. I watched the freezing wind rip through Margaret's hair as she dropped to her knees on the frozen concrete, clutching her forged property documents. The deafening crash of her vintage leather trunk splitting open against the curb echoed like music in the dead of night. She has nowhere to go, Liam whispered. I leaned against the doorframe, perfectly calm. She owns the lot next door, Liam. She's not a victim. Let me tell you how my broke mother-in-law tried to steal my house, and how I destroyed her. But I need to take a step back. To understand how we ended up on that freezing curb, you have to go back 6 months. 6 months ago, my life was exactly how I had designed it. Liam and I had just bought our first house in Evanston. It was a beautiful, historic property with creaky hardwood floors and tall windows that let the light pour in. Liam is an architect, so he spent his weekends obsessing over the molding and the layout. I am a freelance writer. For me, the house wasn't just a place to live. It was my sanctuary. It was my workspace. I spent my 20s living in cramped, noisy apartments, so finally having my own quiet study, it meant everything to me. We made a good living, we had our routines, and we were truly happy. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening, Liam's phone rang during dinner. I watched him put down his fork. He pressed the phone to his ear, his brow furrowing. He barely spoke. He just kept pacing the kitchen floor. Wait, Mom, slow down. What do you mean it's all gone? How much debt? He ended the call and leaned heavily against the marble counter, burying his face in his hands. I walked over and touched his shoulder. Margaret was completely bankrupt. That was the story. She told him a string of terrible financial advice had wiped out her retirement savings, and her landlord was evicting her. Liam looked at me, his eyes pleading. She has nothing, Clara. She just needs a place to stay while she sorts this out. My chest tightened. Margaret and I had never been close. She always had a polite, cutting way of making me feel small, like I was never quite good enough for her son. But Liam was devastated. I couldn't look my husband in the eye and tell him to leave his mother on the street. I took a deep breath and nodded. I told him we would make it work. 2 weeks later, a town car pulled into our driveway. Margaret stepped out. She didn't look destitute. She wore a pristine wool coat and carried an expensive handbag. Behind her, the driver dragged out a massive, vintage leather trunk. Liam rushed out to hug her, taking the heavy trunk and hauling it up the front steps. The moment that leather hit the hardwood floor of our guest room, the entire atmosphere of the house shifted. The air felt thinner. At first, she was polite. She thanked me for my generosity. But within days, my sanctuary started to shrink. It wasn't obvious at first. It was the subtle, quiet things. I'd go to the kitchen for my morning tea, and my favorite mug would be pushed to the back of the cabinet, replaced by her bone china. I'd leave a draft of my manuscript on the living room table, and later find it tucked away in a drawer because it looked cluttered. I tried to brush it off. I retreated to my study, closing the door to focus on my writing deadlines. But the silence I cherished was gone. Instead, there was always a knock. A soft, persistent tapping on the wood. Clara, dear, the thermostat is awfully complicated. Clara, my shows aren't loading on the television. I would open the door, and she'd be standing there, offering a tight, innocent smile. I was losing my focus, my peace, and my space. But when Liam came home from the firm, she was the perfect houseguest. He didn't see the little invasions. He just saw his mother. I told myself to be patient. I had no idea she was already planning to take over the rest of the house. Narcissistic manipulators rarely attack you directly on day one. They use a tactic called micro-invasions. They start small. They move a single chair in your living room. They throw away a small item you left on the counter. They slowly claim a shelf in your kitchen, pushing your things to the back. Psychologically, your living space reflects your identity. When someone else rearranges your home, and you close your eyes to keep the peace, your mind is unconsciously handing over control. It is never just about interior design or different tastes. It is a calculated test. They are measuring your compliance. When you step back just to keep the peace, they realize your boundaries are just an illusion. And once they know that, they move in to tear them down completely. That is exactly what Margaret did. The subtle, quiet invasions quickly turned into written law. One Thursday morning, I walked into the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. A massive whiteboard hung right above our fireplace. It was secured with heavy steel screws, driven straight into the original, historic brickwork. At the top, written in thick black marker, were the words, "Family Manifesto." I stared at the board, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. It was a schedule, but it was exclusively a schedule for me. 7 in the morning, Clara prepares breakfast. 9 to 11, Clara's quiet time. 11:30, Clara cleans the common areas. 1 in the afternoon, Clara runs errands. Margaret strolled into the room, casually sipping from my favorite coffee mug. "Margaret, what is this?" "It is just a little structure, dear. I noticed you have a very chaotic routine. You drilled holes into my wall. And you do not dictate my work hours. There is no need to raise your voice, Clara. I am just trying to help you be more productive." I grabbed an eraser and wiped the board completely clean, leaving black smudges across the white surface. She watched me, her eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I had drawn a firm line. But I was incredibly naive. 2 days later, I went out to meet a publishing client. I was gone for exactly 2 hours. When I walked back through the front door, the house smelled intensely of harsh chemical bleach. A cold dread pooled in my stomach. The silence in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. I dropped my keys on the console table and walked down the hallway toward my study. The heavy oak door, which I always kept strictly shut, was wide open. I stepped inside and the breath completely left my lungs. My antique desk was bare. The towering stacks of reference books were gone. My corkboard, covered in plot outlines, character notes, and pinned photographs, had been stripped clean. And worst of all, the printed manuscript I had spent 4 months meticulously editing was nowhere to be seen. The trash can was empty. The room echoed. I ran into the kitchen. Margaret was standing by the sink, calmly wiping down the pristine marble counter. "Where are my papers? Where is my manuscript?" She did not even look at me. "Oh, that clutter. I put it all in the recycling bin outside. The sanitation truck came by about 20 minutes ago." My hands started to shake. The color drained from my face. "You threw away my work." She finally turned around, offering that same tight, innocent smile that made my blood boil. "I am trying to help you, Clara. That room is far too large and bright to be wasted on a silly little hobby. I took the liberty of measuring the space while you were out. Once we paint the walls a soft pastel yellow, it will make a perfect nursery for the baby. This is my office, you have absolutely no right to touch my things." The front door opened. Liam walked in, loosening his tie, his briefcase in hand. He froze when he saw the two of us standing in the kitchen, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "What is going on?" "Your mother threw away my book, Liam. She emptied my entire study." Liam looked at his mother, his shoulders instantly slumping. "Mom, why would you do that?" Margaret immediately let out a loud, trembling sob, clutching her chest. "I am just preparing for your future, Liam. Someone has to think about this family. She is so selfish, hoarding that massive room for her little stories when you should be starting a family." Liam looked at me, running a tired hand through his hair. "Clara, she is just excited about grandchildren. Can we just calm down and talk about this? I looked at my husband, seeing him clearly for the very first time. He wasn't going to protect me. He was going to let her erase me from my own home, piece by piece. The days that followed were suffocating. Liam tried to smooth things over by buying me a small, cramped desk and shoving it into the corner of our bedroom. He patted my shoulder, telling me it was only temporary, that his mother was just going through a hard time. He was choosing the illusion of peace over his own wife. I stopped eating dinners with them. I stayed in that bedroom, listening to the muffled sounds of Margaret laughing at the television downstairs. My home was no longer mine. It belonged to her. Then, on a Friday night in late November, the truth finally bled out. Liam was working late at the firm. Margaret had taken a sleeping pill and gone to bed early, complaining about her joints. The house was dead quiet. I walked downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water, passing the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. I do not know what pulled me inside. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was pure instinct. I walked into the dark room. Her vintage leather trunk was sitting at the foot of the bed, the brass latches left undone. I knelt on the cold hardwood floor and lifted the heavy lid. I pushed aside her folded cashmere sweaters and silk scarves. My fingers brushed against something hard and cold at the very bottom. I pulled it out. It was a sleek, silver tablet. My hands were shaking. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room. I braced myself, expecting to find a lock screen, but she was too arrogant for that. It opened directly to her email inbox. I thought I would see past due notices. I thought I would see angry messages from landlords or debt collectors. Instead, I saw a message from a senior wealth advisor at a major private bank. I tapped the email. A monthly portfolio statement loaded on the screen. My eyes scanned the numbers, my brain struggling to process the string of commas and zeros. She had over $2 million in liquid assets. She wasn't broke. She wasn't evicted. She was incredibly, comfortably wealthy. My breathing grew shallow. I scrolled down, my finger trembling against the glass. There was another email, marked urgent, from a local real estate attorney. Attached was a finalized purchase agreement. I opened the document. It was a contract for a vacant parcel of land. I looked at the address. 402 Elm Street. My blood ran completely cold. The color drained from my face, and the air felt too thick to breathe. 402 Elm Street was the empty, wooded lot directly next door to our house. She hadn't just faked a bankruptcy to move in. She had manipulated her way into our home to measure us, to break my boundaries, and to test Liam's loyalty. And now, she was secretly buying the land next door to build a massive house, turning our lives into her permanent, personal compound. She wanted to trap us. She wanted to turn my marriage into her empire. I sat there on the floor in the dark, staring at the glowing numbers on the screen. The pathetic, weeping woman who showed up on our doorstep with a trunk and a sob story was a ghost. The woman sleeping in the bed a few feet away from me was a calculated, cold-blooded predator. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I calmly forwarded every single email, every document, and every financial statement to my own secure account. I wiped the sent folder clean. I placed the tablet exactly where I found it, under the silk scarves, and closed the heavy leather lid. I stood up, the darkness in the room no longer suffocating me. For the first time in 6 months, my mind was crystal clear. She wanted to play a game of possession. But she had severely underestimated the woman she was trying to erase. She wanted a war, and I was going to give her one. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen. Margaret was sipping her Earl Grey tea, looking out the window at the falling snow. Liam was sitting at the island, reviewing a blueprint. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just stood at the end of the marble counter and looked directly at her. I know about the tablet, Margaret. Her teacup stopped halfway to her mouth. The silence in the room was absolute. Liam looked up, completely confused. What tablet? The one hidden under her silk scarves, I said, my voice perfectly steady. The one showing her $2 million investment portfolio, and the finalized contract for the empty lot next door. I expected her to panic. I expected her to cry and beg Liam for forgiveness. Instead, she carefully set her teacup down on the saucer. The sweet, fragile old woman vanished in an instant. Her eyes were dark and completely hollow. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slid it across the cold marble toward me. You have been snooping through my private property, Clara. That is very unfortunate. Liam stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Mom, what is she talking about? Are you buying the lot next door? Margaret completely ignored him. Open it, Clara. I pulled the heavy papers from the envelope. It was a formal legal petition. But it wasn't just an eviction notice. It was a property transfer document. At the bottom of the last page, there was a signature. My signature. Or at least, a very careful forgery of it, signing away my entire equity in the house to Margaret. Attached to it was a ridiculous claim that Liam owed her $300,000 in retroactive living expenses from his childhood. You are a very difficult woman to live with, Clara, Margaret said, smoothing her pristine wool skirt. So my attorney and I agreed it is best if you vacate the premises immediately. You already signed the quitclaim deed last week. Liam stared at the paper, the color draining from his face. Mom, you forged her signature. This is insane. I am securing our family's future, Liam. She is trying to tear us apart. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I carefully placed the forged document back on the counter. You made a terrible mistake, Margaret. I turned around and walked out the front door. I didn't spend the next week arguing with Liam. I didn't sleep in that house. I checked into a hotel downtown and went straight to work. I hired one of the most ruthless real estate litigators in Chicago. I handed him the forged deed, the time-stamped security camera footage of Margaret sneaking into my study where I kept my signature stamps, and the complete, unredacted file of her hidden financial empire. 2 weeks later, we were standing in a freezing, fluorescent-lit courtroom. Margaret wore a modest gray cardigan, hunching her shoulders to look small and fragile. Her lawyer stepped forward, launching into a rehearsed speech about an ungrateful daughter-in-law trying to throw a bankrupt, helpless widow out into the freezing winter. My lawyer didn't even argue. He just walked up to the judge's bench and handed over a single, heavy binder. I watched the judge's eyes scan the pages. The silence in the courtroom stretched on forever. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. The judge slowly looked up, fixing his harsh gaze directly on Margaret. Mrs. Thompson. I am looking at a verified statement from a private wealth fund containing over $2 million in your name. I am also looking at a forensic analysis confirming the signature on this quitclaim deed is a crude forgery. Are you aware that falsifying a property document is a felony? Margaret's fragile posture instantly snapped. She looked at her lawyer, pure panic finally breaking through her cold exterior. No, that isn't right, she stole those documents. She hacked my accounts. Sit down, Mrs. Thompson, the judge barked, his voice echoing off the wood panels. Your petition is completely dismissed. And frankly, you are incredibly lucky opposing counsel is only asking for an immediate eviction rather than pressing criminal fraud charges today. He slammed his wooden gavel. You have 24 hours to vacate the property. Margaret started to hyperventilate. She turned around and looked at Liam, her eyes wide and desperate. Liam. Liam, tell them. You cannot let her do this to me. Liam stood frozen, his eyes darting to the floor. He finally saw the monster hiding behind the mother. He didn't say a single word. The 24 hours passed in complete silence. Margaret did not pack. She sat in the guest room, stubbornly believing Liam would step in to save her. She believed her tears would work one last time. She was wrong. At exactly 11:30 that night, the police arrived to enforce the court order. And that brings us back to the freezing snow in Evanston. I grabbed the heavy handle of her vintage leather trunk and dragged it down the hallway. It scraped loudly against the historic hardwood floors. I pushed the front door open, letting the bitter Chicago wind rush inside, and shoved the trunk down the icy steps. It hit the curb with a deafening crash, the brass latches snapping open. Margaret stumbled out into the snow, shivering in her expensive wool coat. She dropped to her knees on the frozen concrete, clutching her useless, forged documents to her chest. Liam stood on the porch, his face pale, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Clara, what the hell is happening?" he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the street. "She has nowhere to go." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. I was perfectly calm. "She owns the lot next door, Liam. She has a private wealth fund. She is not a victim." He stared at the woman weeping in the snow. The illusion was completely shattered, but his cowardice remained. "She is still my mother, Clara." "Did you have to be so cruel?" I stepped closer to him, the icy wind biting my face. "I wasn't cruel, Liam, I was surviving. You watched her erase me from this house, piece by piece, and you did absolutely nothing. You chose your own comfort over my sanity." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the icy ground. Many women step into marriage carrying the heavy wounds of an unstable past. We crave a peaceful home so desperately that we are willing to offer infinite concessions just to buy a little validation. But society rarely teaches us the darkest paradox of family. Yielding to a narcissistic manipulator does not create peace. It simply trains them on how to exploit you better. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it only has value when it is given to someone who actually respects your boundaries. When you are standing face to face with someone who uses the sacred name of family to steal your space and your sanity, ruthless determination is not immoral. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. Cutting off a toxic relationship does not mean you failed to build a family. It means you finally succeeded in protecting the last intact pieces of your own soul. A black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb. Margaret's private driver had arrived. She didn't look at us. She scrambled to her feet, shoved her belongings back into the broken trunk, and climbed into the back seat. The tires crunched against the snow as the car disappeared down the dark street. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. Liam stood on the porch, shivering. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a return to the way things were. He wanted to walk back inside, sit by the fireplace, and pretend the last 6 months were just a bad dream. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. "You can go inside, Liam," I said quietly. "But you will be sleeping in the guest room. Because tomorrow morning, I am packing my things. I am calling my own lawyer." I turned around and walked back into the warmth of the hallway. I closed the heavy oak door to my study. I sat down at my desk, turned on my computer, and opened a blank document. The house was finally perfectly quiet.